Thank you, Norm. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be with you. My only regret is I have to leave after my talk rather quickly to catch a 4:20 flight and turn in a rental car. Otherwise, I would be with you longer. Can you hear me okay if I speak at this level? Mic is all right? Okay, great. As I've said on other occasions, I always like to double check because you never know who might be hard of hearing, might even be me. And which gives me that opportunity to tell a little story that I learned not so long ago about this very elderly man who wanted to see his doctor to inquire about his wife's hearing problems. And so he went to see his doctor and he explained the troubles he'd had with his wife and her hearing. And the doctor said, well, you need to do a test. Go back home and stand in back of your wife a ways and say something. And if she doesn't hear you, then move a little closer. And if she doesn't hear you again, move closer yet. And keep doing that until you get to the point where she can finally hear you, and then come back and tell me what you've learned. So he goes home thinking he's got this problem on the way to resolution. He gets home and he sees his wife at the other end of the kitchen at the stove. And he stands back of her about 20 feet. And he says, honey, what's for supper? No answer. He moves to 15 feet behind her and says, honey, what's for supper? She doesn't respond. Now 10 feet behind her. Honey, what's for supper? She doesn't even turn around. Now 5 feet behind her. He says, honey, what's for supper? She turns around and says, for the fourth time, it's lasagna. So, well, today I'm going to talk to you about real heroes. That's the title I think we gave this talk in your program. And first thing I want to say about it is what constitutes a hero. And then for the balance of the talk, I want to say something about particular heroes. I had a few, there it is. Few notes that I wanted to have in front of me. I think a real hero is one who possesses one or more, usually most, of the following traits of character. And moreover, not only possesses these traits, but has the courage to act upon them. Doesn't just talk about them, or doesn't just live them quietly in his personal life, but also in a very public way takes stands on behalf of these virtues, acts accordingly, and may, in the process, change the lives or save the lives of others. Among the traits that I think are critical for a true hero to possess is honesty. I don't know too many heroes who are consistent or persistent liars. Honesty, being able to speak the truth and to take the truth on and champion it irrespective of the obstacles that you may face, even when it's not popular to embrace the truth, to stand for it and to say so and to live your life accordingly. Honesty is important. Intellectual humility is another trait of, I think, most heroes. Intellectual humility, the recognition that as much as you may know, there's still a universe of knowledge out there that you don't know. That's one of the lessons of I-Pencil that Sherry Wall talked about earlier. When you realize that no one person knows how to make a pencil or a cookie, you realize then, I think, how impossible it is, how preposterous it is to think that you could plan the lives or the economy of 320 million people. I think another important trait is responsibility. Standing up and taking account of your actions, accepting the responsibility that should flow from your decisions. An irresponsible person, of course, doesn't do that. An irresponsible person is one who's looking to blame his or her poor decisions on other people, who expects a bailout for the consequences of his own poor judgments. I don't see how you could have a free society in the absence of widespread personal responsibility. And then courage, I think, is another important attribute of real heroes. Courage. I think it was C.S. Lewis who said that was the parent of all the other virtues. How do we know if you possess the others unless you also possess the courage to live up to the standards of those other traits, and to be a champion of them in your interactions with other people. We are running a series at FEE on our website now every Friday under the title of Real Heroes. How many of you have seen any of the installments so far? Oh, okay. Well, I encourage you to visit fee.org and take a look at that. Every Friday, there's a different person. Could be a living person, could be a person long dead. Last week's hero was Cato the Younger of 2,000 years ago in ancient Rome. This week's hero was Anne Frank, the famous Holocaust victim of the last century. So it could be a living person, dead person, could be a sports hero, whatever. But in each and every case, I think 16 so far, with about 40 more to go, they are people who could be called real heroes because they possessed one or more of the traits I've mentioned, and also the courage to act upon them. So I want to share with you now just a few stories of some real heroes. And I'm going to start with the greatest and most unsurpassed hero of all time. And I don't know that I really need to tell this audience who I'm referring to. I'm talking about Jesus Christ, the greatest of all heroes of all time, and who will not be eclipsed. I want to focus specifically for a few moments on Jesus' teachings with regard to things that we as libertarians are keenly interested in: markets, personal liberty, the role of government. I hope you've all picked up a copy. If not, we have them still out front, of a little essay entitled "Rendering unto Caesar, Was Jesus a Socialist?" And it's that topic I want to give you a short taste of. If you read the entire essay, you'll hear all of this and then some. But we should not, as libertarian Christians, ever allow the statist left to embrace Christ as if he were one of theirs, as if his message is one that is compatible with their message of the forcible, politically driven redistribution of wealth. Christ talked about things like caring for those who you are responsible for, caring for your neighbor, being of a charitable heart. But he never once, anywhere, no place in the New Testament will you find even a hint of this, he never spoke of solving the problems of those in need through political force and redistribution. Never once. I think he would regard that as a cop-out. He would regard that as an even greater sin, to walk away from your responsibility to help those in need and expect a politician to do it in your place. That to me doesn't sound very Christian at all. Christ had plenty of opportunities when he could have endorsed through word or deed redistribution, never did. I'm thinking of Luke 12:13 through 15, when a man approached him and said, "Master, speak to my brother, that he divideth the inheritance with me." Well, that was a request to effectively redistribute wealth. The man felt he wasn't getting his share, and he wanted Christ to do something to make sure he got more. And of course, Christ could have, with a wave of his hand, equalized the wealth between the two or redistributed it in some other way, but his response was, "Man, who made me a judge or divider over you?" I pray for the first day that we hear some politician in Washington actually say that. Wouldn't that be great? Some redistributive big government measure. Wouldn't that be something? For a politician to stand up and say, "I oppose this, and by the way, who made me a judge or divider over 320 million people?" Well, that was Christ's response when given the opportunity to redistribute wealth between people. We saw a brief reference in the video a moment ago to the Good Samaritan story. I recall on a television program in the Bahamas once, I had two statists interviewing me, and they had some wind of the fact that I was a Christian, so they were coming at me from that perspective quite a lot. And at one point they actually said, "Well, Mr. Reed, you surely know the story of the Good Samaritan. I mean, doesn't that make the case for government programs to help the poor?" And talk about softball questions. So I said, wait a minute, think back to the story. Here's a man who had been beaten to within an inch of his life. He's in terrible need. He's lying along the road, and another man comes across the first gentleman, and what does he do? He does not say, oh, well, you should see your social worker, or maybe you ought to call the emperor, or there's a federal program that would help you, but I got other things to do. No, he pitched in immediately and helped the guy himself. That's what made him a good Samaritan. If he had done any of those other things, we wouldn't remember him today, would we? Except as the good-for-nothing Samaritan. So there's nothing in that story that suggests political redistribution, but rather suffer with, help yourself, be responsible, chip in. Don't think you're fulfilling your duty to your fellow man in distress by walking away and expecting some distant politician to step in and solve the problem. Christ said that he came to this world in part to fulfill the law, by which he was referring to the Ten Commandments and to the prophecies of his coming. Well, as I read the Ten Commandments, they are pretty powerful statements in a lot of respects on a lot of different issues, but two in particular I think have something to say about things like private property and redistribution. Thou shalt not steal, the eighth commandment, and thou shalt not covet, the 10th commandment. Have you noticed that each one ends with a period right after the words covet or right after the word steal? There's nothing there that says thou shalt not steal unless you're just absolutely sure you could spend it better than the guy who earned it. Thou shalt not steal unless you can find a politician who will do it on your behalf. Or thou shalt not steal unless you can whip up a majority in the next election and do it en masse through majority rule. It says basically, if it's not yours, keep your cotton-picking fingers off of it, period. So I see Christ's message as one of personal responsibility, stepping up to the plate and helping others through your own personal wherewithal and through love from your heart. And that's totally different from expecting distant politicians to do it through political force. So just a few words on one of obviously many and even better reasons why Christ should be regarded as the greatest hero of all time. I hope you'll read that essay and pick up a little more ammunition to use the first time somebody accosts you and says that Jesus would be in favor of political redistribution. A few other quick stories here of people that I regard as heroes. Here's a glimpse at one you haven't read yet on our website because I wrote it for next Friday, but I'll give you a little taste of it in advance. You're the first audience to hear about it. How many of you have heard the name of a woman passed away in 1975? Her name was Vivian Kellems. Anybody know who Vivian Kellems was? Oh, I love this woman. I hope you'll read this piece when it comes out next Friday. Vivian Kellems was an inventor and a very successful entrepreneur. That's only half of the story, but in the 1920s, she and her brother invented it was called a cable grip, a device for grasping large bundles of cables, electrical and otherwise. And then she was the one, after she and her brother together invented it, who actually formed the company to market these cable grips. She formed a company in Stonington, Connecticut called the Kellems Grip Company. And she started selling them like hotcakes. And when World War II broke out, the government had a huge demand for these cable grips. They had some various military uses. In 1942, think back to that year. That's just after Pearl Harbor, which was December of 41. First full year of our involvement in the Second World War. Everybody was rallying behind the government's effort to win this colossal battle. You'd think that you'd think twice before you take on, in a major challenging way, the policies of the government at a time of war. But Vivian Kellems, throughout her life, displayed a desire to speak out on what she knew was right the moment she sensed that it was right. She didn't wait. So in 1942, she spoke out, took on the Roosevelt administration, with whom she's doing business, selling these cable grips already, and said, hey, this administration has taken a lot of these grips that I'm manufacturing and sending them over to Comrade Stalin, who's our newfound ally. And she warned in public speech after public speech that this temporary ally, Joseph Stalin, would come back to bite us later. And everything we send him is an article of war we could and should be using ourselves to win the conflict. So she didn't endear herself to Franklin Roosevelt, but she spoke out whenever she felt the need. She uncovered all kinds of bureaucratic snafus and cost overruns and bungling and needless regulation, and all through the war years was speaking out and pointing out examples of those things. It was in 1948 that she really captured national attention. It was during the war, late in the war, that the government instituted the process of withholding taxes. But it was 1948 when that became compulsory for all businesses. They had to, by law, withhold taxes from their employees and send those taxes to the federal government. In February of 1948, after this became compulsory, Vivian Kellems held a news conference, well attended. She got lots of national attention for this, and she said, I am not going to comply with the law. I will not be an unpaid tax collector for the federal government. This is unconstitutional. She actually said, Harriet Tubman was president by this time, she made the famous statement at that announcement. She said, if high tax Harry wants me to be a tax collector for him, he's going to have to put me on the payroll and I want a badge. Well, she challenged the constitutionality of compulsory unpaid withholding, making business people the scapegoats in a process to get more out of the pockets of working Americans. This woman challenged the federal government, its income tax, its withholding policies, at every turn on more than just tax issues, and she fought more than just the federal government. In the 1950s, the state of Connecticut passed a law that said no woman could be employed by a business to work after 10 p.m. in the evening. Okay, she just thought that was totally unconstitutional, none of their business when women choose to work. And she was already an extremely successful businesswoman at that point. She had hundreds of women working for her. And so in response to that law in Connecticut, she called her women out and into the factory at 10 o'clock at night to work a night shift, just to dare the government to come and arrest them. Well, at that point, she was well enough known figure that the cops didn't show up. The state didn't arrest anybody, but she was kind of unhappy about that. She said she wanted to challenge this law, and she was hoping they'd send the cops and arrest somebody. So when they didn't, guess what she did? Here's a millionaire businesswoman. She goes out and gets an all-night job as a waitress at a diner, and then dares the government to arrest her and says, I'm working in this diner, it's none of your business. And well, it raised such a fuss that within 2 days, the state of Connecticut repealed that law. So now there's a hero. She continued to fight the tax collectors for all the right reasons, high taxes, runaway spending, deficits, and so forth. A very outspoken woman giving speeches all over the country. She was on the cover of Time magazine, just a very famous woman of her day. She died in 1975, and as near as we can tell, for the last 10 years of her life, she never filled out a personal income tax form. She'd sent them all in blank. And in all those 10 years of the last 10 years of her life, the government never went after her. I think too afraid of her because she had such a large following and was so articulate. Well, she was a hero. Speaking of women, you know, there's a discussion in Washington right now about who to put on the $10 bill. Which woman from American history to put on the $10 bill. And there's a list that's been widely circulated of people like Eleanor Roosevelt. She's on the list. And Harriet Tubman is another, 4 or 5 others. And I saw some reference just this past week that Eleanor Roosevelt, for the moment, seems to have the inside track. What a terrible choice that would be. She's not in my list of real heroes. I want to suggest one that could be a far better woman to put on the $10 bill. But Eleanor Roosevelt was bad news from start to finish. She was born with a silver spoon in her mouth, never really did anything to take a risk or build anything. She was a speech maker, a pontificator, a writer of a really dumb column for like 26 years called My Day. I remember going back, you can actually get them today. You can get the entire compilation of her 26 years of columns. And boy, you want a substitute for Sominex. Read that column. There was one I came across as I was leafing through it where she's talking about world peace. And she says, Mr. So-and-so from somewhere wrote in a really good idea to me. And he says that to bring peace with the Soviets, we ought to send some American families over to Moscow, so they have to live there, and we'll have Khrushchev send some Soviet families over here, and then the two sides would never go to nuclear war because they'd have these hostages on each side. What do you say about something like that? She says, this is a pretty good idea, she says in that column. Well, here's a better candidate. One other thing, by the way, that the American people don't to this day know much about. Do you know she had her own totalitarian impulses? There was a columnist who often wrote some things critical of her and her husband named Westbrook Pegler. And she grew to dislike him immensely. Well, do you know what she wanted done about him? He hadn't done anything illegal. He just differed strongly with the Roosevelt administration. She got a hold of J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI and said, you need to investigate Westbrook Pegler. I think he's a foreign stooge. I think he's probably an agent of some foreign government. There was no evidence of that. But Hoover, you know, this is the First Lady, so you got to follow up. Well, he conducted an investigation and got back to Eleanor and said, there's nothing there. He's a writer. He writes for newspapers, period. That's it. You know what she did then? She had a number of good friends who wrote for the Communist Party's Daily Worker in New York, and she leaks Hoover's report on Pegler to the Communist Daily Worker, to her friends there, and says, I need to get back to the FBI director and tell him why he should reopen the investigation. Why don't you guys dig up some dirt on Westbrook Pegler, and I'll get back to Hoover with it. You want to put her on a $10 bill? A woman who was so ready to use federal power to crush somebody simply for disagreeing with things that she supported or that her husband supported? I wouldn't put her on anything but a wanted poster, frankly. But a woman who has been mentioned that I would strongly endorse is a real hero, and that is Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born in 1820 in Maryland. She was a slave, but at the age of 29, 1849, she mustered the courage to flee to the north to escape slavery. And you know, if she had done nothing thereafter but to live a life as a free woman, you'd still say, well, maybe she could have done more, but hooray for her. But it wasn't enough to Harriet Tubman to have secured her own freedom. She immediately became involved in the Underground Railroad so as to bring liberty to others. And before all is said and done, she will be perhaps the best known conductor in the famous Underground Railroad, having made 13 trips, very risky trips, back into slave states, escorting dozens of slaves on this very perilous journey to freedom in northern states. And the 70 plus that she saved included her aging parents, her siblings, and many friends and other people she didn't know. She often said in later years that her train never went off the track and she never lost a passenger. After the Civil War, I want to share with you something that Frederick Douglass said. How many know who Frederick Douglass was? Very well known, great orator, great friend of liberty, former slave, and outspoken defender of individual liberty. He, in 1868, said this in a letter to Harriet Tubman: "Most that I have done and suffered in the service of our cause has been in public, and I have received much encouragement at every step of the way. You, on the other hand, have labored in a private way. I have wrought in the day, you in the night. I have had the applause of the crowd and the satisfaction that comes of being approved by the multitude, while the most that you have done has been witnessed by a few trembling, scarred, and footsore bondmen and women whom you have led out of the house of bondage, and whose heartfelt God bless you has been your only reward. The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism." She spent the last decades of her life, she lived into the 20th century, caring for the sick and for the aged, and doing it though she had so little resources of her own. And you may not know this, but something happened in her 70s that only reinforces, I think, Harriet Tubman as a real hero in so many ways. Back when she was a slave, her slave master once hit her very hard with a 2-pound weight that caused a lifetime of dizziness, occasionally blurry vision. She had manifestations from that beating for quite some time. In her 70s, in the 1890s, Harriet Tubman decides to have brain surgery because the doctors say they think they can relieve some of those symptoms that she'd been suffering for all those years. Well, the amazing thing was she refused anesthesia. Do you know what she requested? And they did the operation with this. She said, "I just need a bullet." She bit down on a bullet while they did brain surgery on her. I have a quote that she said many times afterwards, for years after. It was successful too, by the way. She died in 1913 at the age of 91. She said, "The surgeons, quote, sawed open my skull and raised it up, and now it feels a lot more comfortable." Can you imagine? Now, there's a woman that deserves to be on the $10 bill, I think, and I would certainly support that. A great hero in many ways. A couple other people in the time we have left. Here's one from another country, a great prime minister of Great Britain. I know you're thinking I'm going to talk about Margaret Thatcher. She was great too, but my favorite was William Ewart Gladstone. What a remarkable man. We need to dust him off and read more about him. What a thoroughgoing, lifelong, committed Christian as well. William Ewart Gladstone still holds the record to this day as having been prime minister more times than anybody else. He was prime minister 4 times. The last time was when he was in his 80s, in the 1890s. He was prime minister for the 4th time. 61 years in the House of Commons. He was known in Britain as the Great Commoner because he always refused any offers at titles. He could have been in the House of Lords later in life and carried a fancy title, but he always refused. He was truly a man of the people. And he's one of the few examples in history of a politician who actually got better the longer he was in government. How often does that happen? Usually, you know, the temptations of power take even the best of people and grind them up, make it difficult to remain good in office. But here's a guy who only got better. When he first entered government, he was an ardent anti-free trade protectionist. He was in favor of sustaining all the special privileges that the well-off in Britain had accrued through their political connections. He was a crusty old conservative, you might say, in those days. But fairly early, he showed a deep interest in individual liberty And in fact, here's a man who read more than 20,000 books in his lifetime, and actually physically in his 80s carted almost all of those 20,000 books by wheelbarrow from his home, Harden Castle in North Wales, to a library he endowed with his entire collection upon his death. This man was very well read. He was a classical scholar. He was a solid Christian, wrote many books himself on Christian apologetics. William Ewart Gladstone came early to appreciate the error of his earlier ways and became a steadfast advocate of expanding personal liberty and reducing the scope of the state. When it came, for instance, to tariffs, by his 80s, when he was prime minister for the fourth time, he was able to brag that when he first entered government, Britain had 1,200 tariffs interfering with trade with other countries. But by the time he was done in the 1890s, the number of tariffs that Britain had was down to 12, from 1,200 to 12, and they were minimal. Britain was the capital of capital. It was the center of the free trade that came to dominate Europe by the late 19th century, and Gladstone was a big reason for it. He spent his political career trying to reduce taxes, reducing the size and scope of government. He would fire people steadfastly if they fought him as he tried to reduce the spending of the British government. He was, even in his foreign policy, a non-interventionist as much as possible, certainly the most non-interventionist of all the British prime ministers of the 19th century. He was dueling all the time with Benjamin Disraeli over this issue of empire. And Gladstone felt very strongly that Britain shouldn't be running around the world, taking over places and imposing its rule, that instead it should lead by being the best example in the world for liberty and for commerce. One of my favorite quotes of his is this on foreign policy. He said, "My foreign policy, in a phrase, is this: good government at home." That's his foreign policy. Good government at home. And my favorite of all Gladstone phrases is the following. He said, "We look forward to the day when the power of love replaces the love of power, and then the world will know true peace." Isn't that a beautiful quote? We look forward to the day when the power of love replaces the love of power, and then the world will know true peace. There's a great hero, a man who could honestly say at the end of his tenure in government that government was smaller, in large part because of his efforts, that the initiation of force in society was much reduced from what it was when he had entered government 61 years before. Great man. Finally, I want to tell you about a man, another Brit that I knew personally and who passed away only last month. A wonderful man. I knew him for the last dozen years of his life. He died the 1st of July at the age of 106. I tried to visit him every year in the 12 years that I knew him. He lived outside of London in a little town called Maidenhead, and his name was Sir Nicholas Winton, W-I-N-T-O-N. How many have heard of Nicky Winton? Okay, if you Google that name, you'll find a lot of things. You'll even find CBS's 60 Minutes a year ago last April did a segment on him entitled Saving the Children, and you can watch that video if you go to the 60 Minutes site. Nicky Winton in the 1930s was in his 20s as a stockbroker. In fact, in 1938, he was, I believe, 29 years of age. 1938 was the last full year of peace before the outbreak of the Second World War. A very momentous year. In March of that year, Hitler had absorbed Austria in the so-called Anschluss. Then he started rattling his saber against Czechoslovakia, demanding the border region that belonged to the Czechs called the Sudetenland. There was a conference in Munich, Germany in September of 38 to deal with the threat of war posed by Hitler's demands for the Sudetenland. And it was at that Munich conference, of course, that the British and the French effectively gave Hitler the Sudetenland, turned their backs on the Czechs and said, go ahead and take it, but promise you won't go any further. And Neville Chamberlain of Great Britain returned from that conference on the tarmac in London, waving that slip of paper, and famously said, we have peace in our time. But it didn't last even a year. Well, it was in the wake of Munich that Nicky Winton decides to go on a Christmas vacation in Switzerland. A lot of the world thought, wow, we dodged a bullet, we have peace, we feel a lot better now. Nicky Winton knew that Hitler wasn't going to be satiated by that agreement. He knew that it was only a matter of time, but he nonetheless plans this vacation. But a friend of his who worked in the British Embassy in Prague, Czechoslovakia, urged him to forego the Swiss vacation and come instead to Prague because there was something he just had to see. And so Nicky ultimately conceded and said, okay, I'll come to Prague. And his friend wanted him to see the refugee camps in and around Prague, full of thousands of mostly Jewish families who had only recently fled, in some cases Germany, some Poland, but mostly the Sudetenland for Prague to get away from Hitler. They wanted out of Czechoslovakia altogether because they knew that Hitler was going to come for the rest. But no country would allow them to enter theirs. None. They were trapped, no place to go, in harm's way. So Nicky's walking through these refugee camps, and parents coming up, sometimes with babes in arms, small children. They ask him, as a perfect stranger, they plead with him, will you please take our children? Take our children out. Can you get our children out? That tells you something about how desperate parents have to be to ask a perfect stranger, take my child. Nicky could have said, well, gee, I feel for you, I wish I could, sorry I can't help, I'm supposed to be on vacation, I'll see what I can do. But he immediately swung into action because he's a man of character, and first thing he did was to send letters and telegrams to governments all over the world asking, if I can get the children out, will you allow them to enter your country? Only two said yes, his own Britain and Sweden. So he starts having to raise the money to get the kids out. He has to find foster families in Britain, a few in Sweden, mostly in Britain, who will agree to take the children in. The parents have no hope of getting out, but they want their children to get to safety. Before it's all over, Nicky will arrange 9 rail transports of children and arrange for every one of them to have a foster family agreed to take them in. The first 8 of those transports by rail to the coast off the English Channel and then ultimately and mostly to Britain. The first 8 transports had 669 children, some babies. The only reason he couldn't talk about what he did for another 50 years was what happened to the 9th and the last of the rail transports. It was the largest of them all, 250 children, ready to go. He had them all assembled at Prague Station on the 1st of September, 1939. That was the day that World War II broke out. The Nazis stopped all rail transports, and not a single one of those 250 children survived. We think of the 669 he saved, but for 50 years he was haunted by the 250 that he couldn't, and all the others that were on his list that never even made it to the train station. He joined the RAF, fought for 6 years, later met the woman who became his wife, and never told her of what he had done before the war. Just too painful to talk about. The children grow up in foster homes. Almost none of them ever saw their parents again. And they don't know, though, how do we get out? Who saved us? The story just sort of faded. And then in 1988, when his wife was going through the attic, she finds this box of stuff, visa material, pictures of kids, things back from that period, and she wants to know, what's all this? And he finally tells her. And then the story gets out. And then the British people learn of this for the first time in a nationally televised program. You can see it on YouTube to this day. Just type in Nicholas Winton, where the television show had gotten hold of these materials, including a list of the children. And they went around Britain trying to find as many of those children now, in their 50s and 60s, and get them to come to the television station. And they tell Nicky Winton, we want you on this program. We're going to tell your story. We're going to put you in the front row, middle seat. He had no idea who else would be in the audience. And so they tell the story before a national television audience. And at one point, the hostess says, might there be someone in this audience who was among the children that Nicky Winton saved 50 years ago? If so, please stand. And everybody in the audience stands. And there he meets those children, now 50s and 60s, for the first time in 50 years. Well, he just died at 106. I think that was the Lord's way of saying, well done, thy good and faithful servant. And he was mentally sharp to the very end. In May, when I saw him, he was reciting poetry to me off the top of his head. Physically had slowed down, but was still as mentally as sharp as ever. The last thing I said to him as I was leaving was, Nicky, I'll be back in 1 year to see you for your 107th. And he said, you're very good at arithmetic. He always had a great sense of humor, a sunny, optimistic attitude about life. And I don't know that I'll ever personally know somebody of greater character than him. Do you know how many people were alive, many of whom still are, if you count up all the people that he saved and their kids and grandkids and great-grandkids who were alive or still are because of his actions? It's now more than 6,000 people because of one man's character who stood forward and said, I can do something here. When the governments of the world were at the source of the problem, and only 2 would even allow the children to enter their countries, one man put enough heat on the powers that be that he could end up saving 669 lives. There is a real hero, if ever there was one. I'd like to think that here in this audience, there are some real heroes and some soon-to-be real heroes. In fact, I want to introduce you to one. Sometimes you get the feeling when you meet somebody, this person's going places. I want to get his autograph now while I can afford it. And such a man, I think, is Ashton Moore in the back. Ashton, will you raise your hand? Ashton and his friend Ray Ahmed are co-founders of a new group called freedmenpac.org, F-R-E-E-D, Freedmen, all one word, PAC, P-A-C.org. And in talking to his colleague Ray and to Ashton this morning, I just thought, wow, here are these guys at this young age. They're fired up for liberty. And what are they doing? They're forming an organization to go out to spread the message among those in communities that are often difficult for us to reach. African Americans, other minorities, with a message of liberty, and try to get them to be politically involved and active on behalf of these ideas. So I just wanted to cite Ashton and encourage you to visit their website. He's right here in Austin as a student, as is Ray, at the University of Texas here in Austin. I think you've got a future hero in your midst right here. Thanks, everybody. If we have any time for questions, I'd be happy to take one or take them.